Last time we spoke about the Battle of Wakti. Operation Tornado, the amphibious assault of Wakti Island, faced many logistical challenges, but not as much as the Japanese resistance. The landing at Auri was a large success, seeing the Allies secure a beachhead before advancing inland. Through a combination of air, naval, and ground attacks, the smaller Japanese force was pushed back. Likewise, the islands of Liki and Naromore were taken with relative ease. Over in the Burma-India theater, the battle for Kohima was gradually seeing the Japanese fail to meet their objectives. Without ammunition or provision supplies flowing in to them, the Japanese at Kohima had no hope of holding back the Allies. Thus, the Japanese were beginning to fall back, and now they were setting up defenses to stop the Allies from entering central Burma. Meanwhile, a siege was being erected against Mkenya. This episode is the Siege of Myitkyina. Welcome back to the Pacific War Podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just wanted to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, over at YouTube. Over there, I just released my 4th episode in my series on the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, this one titled The Defense of Harbin. Also, please check out my booming Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the Patreon-exclusive podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what I'll tackle next. Please go check it out. Last time we saw, General Vinegar Joe had managed to seize the Mkenya airstrip. Now the Allied forces were gradually securing Northern Burma, pushing further towards Mang. The Japanese 18th Division were absolutely battered and barely holding on around Mang. However, when the American-Chinese forces seized Mkenya's airstrip, they had failed to quickly attack the main town, which the Japanese were reinforcing heavily. Now they were being attacked from both ends. This prompted General Stillwell to dispatch General Boatner with a task force to try and turn things around. Simultaneously, Stillwell had just received word that the Chindits had abandoned the Blackpool stronghold. He was outraged by this, so he ordered them to advance northwards to support the attack against Mang. 3 brigades, the 111th, the 14th, and the 3rd West Africans, were to advance north to support Calvert's 77th Brigade to take Mang. The Chindits were incredulous. Nonetheless, Letang, pressed by Stillwell, sought to have his 3rd West Africans, the 14th and 111th Brigades, squeeze the Japanese along the western flanks of the Mang Valley, in which Mang occupied the lowest point of an inverted triangle, with the other 2 points being Mang on the top left and Myitkyina on the top right. With any luck, his 3 brigades could capture Mang, which occupied an enviable place on the Mang River. The 111th Brigade were to move northeast and operate in the Bohak-Sama area, destroying ammunition dumps and blocking enemy movement. The more battered men of the 111th Brigade struggled to cope with the march going north, to the hills east of Lachren and to the west of Mang. Conditions were appalling on the 3-day march to Lachren village. From Lachren, the best approach to Mang would be identified. They were making for a waterlogged, mosquito-infested area northeast of the lake. This area was also alive with Japanese units. They were required to support the 77th Brigade's attack on Mang by pushing from the west as Calvert's command advanced from the southeast. However, the 111th Brigade was spent after the Blackpool operation, and many of the men were forced to return to Lachren village. There was also a new task for the 14th Brigade, the capture of Tong Ni. With the casualties now evacuated, the 14th Brigade abandoned the Kunsalai Pass, and they headed north towards Mang. The steamy swamps continued to take their toll within the ranks of the York and Lancaster columns. Dysentery was rife. Animals collapsed, and they were shot when they dropped. They reached Mokso on June the 25th. The much-used rallying point consisted of 4 huts. It was a sea of mud and detritus, decorated with black clouds of flies. Rations were being consumed rapidly in an area devoid of drop zones. Brigadier Brodie, the 14th Brigade's commander, responded to the extreme circumstances. His men, despite their dangerously poor condition, were still expected to harass the Japanese along the railway and to support the 77th Brigade's assault against Mang. He formed his columns into light battle groups, free of heavy weapons and the wounded and the sick, now lying together in the mud. Meanwhile, some Nigerian units were struggling on the road to Lachren, along the railway, as were the York and Lancaster sick, around 300 in all, 200 of whom were very dangerously ill. On May the 25th, the same day the Chindits had quit Blackpool, Stillwell ordered the Morris Force to seize Wangma, across the river from Mkenya. Unfortunately, the Japanese had entrenched themselves at the town, and they enjoyed the luxury of a natural moat after the heavy rains flooded the fields on the approaches to the town. Morris' force was not a proper brigade, having only 2 columns of troops, to which a third from the 111th Brigade had been added, thus about 1,500 troops in total. It had been conceived to harass the Japanese on the jungle areas. Now they were up against fortified positions, however. The result was a bloodbath. Morris' force then began to rapidly deplete in strength. By July the 14th, it was to only consist of exactly 3 platoons, roughly 120 men. On May the 31st, Boatner then launched his first coordinated attack against Mkenya, seeing the 42nd Regiment reach the Mangmar Ferry Road. Built up 12 feet above the neighboring paddy fields, the road gave the Japanese a magnificent defensive position, which they exploited cleverly. The Chinese recoiled from this natural fortification, but they were able to beat off a Japanese counterattack. The 150th Regiment reached the riverbank and drew up in an arc about a sawmill, to which the Japanese had a strong point. Meanwhile, Colonel Hunter's 2nd Battalion, reinforced with engineers, advanced to Ragapur, where they were heavily counterattacked by the 114th Regiment. The next day, the inexperienced 236th Engineer Battalion was sent against Namqui. The motive behind the 236th attack was to contain the Japanese in the Namqui area and to introduce the battalion to combat under relatively easy conditions. One company of the 236th did succeed in entering Namqui, but instead of promptly consolidating to meet the inevitable Japanese counterattack, they fell back for a break. The Japanese counterattacked and they drove the unwary engineers right back out of the village. Both the engineers and the 2,600 replacements of the Galahad unit that had recently arrived lacked adequate experience fighting the Japanese and, as such, suffered badly when fighting against them. Colonel Hunter's veteran marauders, however, had suffered ample casualties, and thus they needed green re-emplacements in order to continue existing as a fighting force. Boatner tossed a last-ditch effort on June the 3rd, but his Chinese forces had suffered 320 casualties and their ammunition was running low. While he waited for supplies to build up, he used his green American troops to give them some experience. The Chinese, meanwhile, tunneled towards the Japanese, still suffering heavy casualties. This allowed more Japanese troops to break through and reinforce Mkenya, with a huge relief force of the 52nd Division soon on its way. Meanwhile, Lieutenant General Matsuyama Yuzo of the depleted 56th Division was facing a deadly offensive of his own on the Yunnan front. After a series of negotiations between Chiang Kai-shek and the Americans, it had been agreed General Wei Lihang's Y Force would cross the Salween River to attack Tongchang and the Long Ling areas. This would effectively allow the Allies to link the Lido Road back up with China, bypassing the heavy Japanese concentration along the Burma Road. Although the Americans had supplied the Y Force with artillery and ammunition, the Chinese had failed to bring the Y Force divisions up to strength, and many questioned their training. Regardless, General Wei planned to have elements of the 20th Army Group cross the Salween at several points before initiating a full assault against Tongchang, once reinforcements had been ferried through. Further south, elements of the 11th Army Group would also cross the Salween to launch attacks against Pingda and Long Ling. On the night of May the 11th, the Chinese forces began to cross the Salween River against little Japanese resistance, since Matsuyama had decided not to defend the crossing sites, instead placing his main line of resistance against a ridge about 20 miles west. The 198th Division had been able to assemble in front of the Mamane Pass. The 36th Division was successfully ferried through the Mkena. The brand new 39th Division managed to secure the Huijin Bridge. The 76th and 88th Divisions were converging on Pingda for the attack. On May the 12th, the 198th were making good progress against the Mamane Pass, as the 36th had surrounded the Japanese outposts in the eastern end of the Dantujai Pass. However, Colonel Katsurage Yasuyoshi had his 148th Regiment launching 2 surprise night counterattacks. All of that night, the Japanese quietly filtered down from a nearby ridge and assembled near the Chinese position. Attacking at dawn, they surprised the Chinese and almost wiped them out before their aid could come. When darkness came, the 36th were at their bivouac. That night, the Japanese attacked vigorously, overrunning the division command post and causing the flustered 36th Division to fall back to the Salween. At dawn, the 53rd Army commander, Major General Chu Fo-chung, pushed a regiment across the Salween and restored the situation by attacking the Japanese flank. General Cho was an aggressive and tenacious fighter, whom his Manchurian soldiers nicknamed him Old Board Back, for he had a reputation of never yielding an inch to the Japanese. But even Joe could not immediately restore the morale of the 36th Division, which for some weeks took no further part in the Tatangsu fighting. The rest of the 53rd Army had to bear the burden of clearing the pass. In response to this, Lieutenant General Zhou Fucheng of the 53rd Army pushed the 116th and the 130th Divisions across the river to resume the advance towards Tiantojia. At the Mamine Pass, the 592nd and the 594th Regiments began clearing out the Japanese strongpoints, while the 593rd Regiment moved west over mountain byways to emerge into the Shuili Valley by the 16th, securing the western end of the pass and forcing Kuroshige's men to withdraw into the fortified village of Shanshan-Gofang. To the south, the new 39th would be able to secure the Humushu by the 17th. Yet the Japanese under Colonel Matsue Hideji soon recovered from the initial surprise of the Chinese offensive, and the 1st Battalion 113th Regiment drove the Chinese from the Hongmushu. The Japanese exploited their success, and they pushed the entire new 39th Division back against the Salween. Further south, the 76th Division met outposts of the 1st Battalion 146th Regiment. They forced them back to the heights overlooking Binka. Meanwhile, the 88th Division from the north was fighting through a series of fortified villages as they headed south to join the 76th Division. By the 16th, 13 villages were occupied in the area northeast of Binka. But the Japanese, as they withdrew, received reinforcements. Strengthened by the 2nd Battalion 113th Regiment, the Japanese did not attack the Chinese who were pursuing them, but moved south to hit the Chinese 228th Regiment just southwest of Binka. Sensing the imminent danger from the north, Matsuyama directed the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 113th Regiment to reinforce Shanshan-Gofang, where Kurosige would continue to resist staunchly. Reports from the American liaison teams were not cheerful about this action. Americans observing the Kaolokung Range action found that the Japanese fire was accurate and economical, and that the enemy's use of camouflage and concealment approached perfection. The Japanese revealed no disposition to surrender, though they were heavily outnumbered, often surrounded, and had neither air support nor air supply. On the other hand, the Americans reported that the Chinese endlessly wasted manpower and ammunition in costly frontal attacks. They reported that relations with the Chinese were not always as friendly as they had hoped, and they believed there would be a better cooperation between the Chinese and Americans if the Japanese were defeated. The Chinese were described as merely tolerating the Americans' presence and paying little attention to their advice. The liaison personnel freely admitted their own shortcomings, and by the reports, they suggested that patience was the most important quality for a liaison officer to cultivate a relationship when dealing with the Chinese. Matsuyama had spread his forces widely, over a near 60-mile sector. Thus, he would be unable to perform mobile operations, and he was gradually shifting to a defense of the Kaolokung Mountain Range by the 20th. This allowed the 53rd Army to continue their advance and the new 39th to retake Humushu. By late May, the 198th Division apparently contained the north. Kurosige then rushed with the 113th Regiment to reinforce the Tiantojia front, where they successfully stopped the 53rd Army on its tracks. Yet on June the 1st, the 54th Army emerged in the Shuili Valley from the Tatangsu Pass, where they would join the 593rd Regiment from the Mamine Pass. The next day, the Chinese occupied Jeito Village, and they began patrolling the Shuili Valley. They took the advice of the Y-Force officers, and they donned Burmese clothing. Under disguise, they found it easy to enter Japanese-held villages. When taken by surprise, the Japanese were willing to abandon many of their outer defenses. With TNT charges dropped by the 27th Troops carrier C-47s when the weather cleared, the 198th Division also blew up the last pillboxes at the Chakungtang on June the 13th. When the last shots had been fired, and the Chinese farmer boys of the 54th Army reported the area was secure, there was a bewilderment at finding only 75 Japanese bodies in the defenses that must have been manned by at least 300 men. There would be a great shock and nausea when the Japanese kitchens revealed how the defenders had been able to prolong their stay. Pitiful and ghastly evidence showed that the Japanese had resorted to cannibalism when their rations failed. On June the 14th, the Japanese further quit Chao Tochai, leaving many stores of the 2nd Reserve and the 36th Division. In the end, the Kurashige detachment would pull back to Watien, while the Inose battalion retreated towards Kutungchai. General Wei then ordered the 71st Army to cross the Salween, just below the Hutong Bridge, to attack Long Ling, while his containing force attacked the strong Japanese garrison at Mang. 20,000 troops of the 71st would cross the river by June the 5th. At this time, the 76th Division left a regiment to besiege Pinga, while the bulk pushed on towards Matsuma's HQ at Mangxi, while the 9th Division crossed the Salween, cutting up Pinga's line of communication. On June the 4th, the new 28th Division attacked Mang and forced Major Kanemutsu Kijiro's garrison to retreat into the Mount Song fortress, where they would hold out for several months. While the new 28th held down Kanemitsu, the 87th Division continued toward Long Ling, joining up with the 88th on June the 8th to begin a siege of the main Japanese position along the Yunnan front. The Japanese still held out onto the Burma Road east of Long Ling, but as of June the 7th, the 87th Division had covered about 2/3 of the distance along the Burma Road, from the river to Long Ling. The Chinese had to deal with small Japanese tanks, which had some moral effect but failed to halt the Japanese advance. Indeed, the latter had been fairly swift, for the Chinese had surprised the Japanese, that had been able to ease their supply problems by capturing some of the Japanese rice depots. To meet the new crisis, Matsuyama dispatched the 1st Battalion 119th Regiment to stop the 2nd Army at Xiangdaxiang, and then to attack Long Ling from the south. Matsuyama ordered Colonel Matsue Hideki to immediately relieve Long Ling from the north, and for Yamazaki's composite group to keep the Mongshui-Long Ling road open. Meanwhile, Lieutenant General Song Shilian had been making some progress against Long Ling's 2 outer heights. The stout defenders would manage to repel the uncoordinated Chinese assaults for about a week. 4 days of uncoordinated infantry attacks with little artillery support failed to carry the 3 mounds inside Long Ling, and there was nothing to show for the heavy drain on the 71st ammunition stock. This gave more time for Matsuyama's reinforcements to arrive by June the 14th. On the 15th, Matsue launched a heavy attack in coordination with the besieged defenders, successfully defeating the 71st Army and consequently driving the Chinese from the vicinity of Long Ling. The Japanese had thus been able to drive back over 10,000 Chinese, effectively by an attack using only 1,500 men. Repeated attempts by American liaison personnel with the 71st Army to learn how a small Japanese garrison could drive back a Chinese army group only brought embarrassed smiles from Chinese officers. The Chinese finally related on June the 25th that the 261st Regiment had bolted, and that the commanding general of the 87th Division had attempted to kill himself. When further details of the fighting around Long Ling were available, anger and annoyance spread from Y-Force to the Generalissimo himself. Y-Force personnel considered the Chinese decision to withdraw from the Long Ling inexcusable because the 11th Army Group had sent forward no reinforcements to meet the initial Japanese counterattacks. Of the 21 battalions in the Long Ling vicinity on June the 14th, only 9 took part in the actual fighting. In describing the defensive attitude of the 259th Regiment, as an example of the conduct that had cost the chance of a speedy breakthrough into Burma, one American liaison officer wrote this: "From the time that we had crossed the river until we reached Long Ling, the regimental commander continually had his troops in the rear digging emplacements in trenches in fear that they would have to retreat." Yet that is all for today for the Yunnan battle, as we now need to head over to the Kamang front. General Tanaka's 18th Division were withdrawing with the 22nd and 38th Division in hot pursuit. Over to the south, the Seton roadblock had been held by the 112th Regiment, threatening to thwart Tanaka's plans. Coming to their aid, General Sun sent his 113th and 114th Regiments to descend upon Lawa, where General Eda began an unauthorized retreat on June the 4th. The abandonment of Lawa severely affected the defense of Kamang. Thus General Eda was relieved of command and replaced with Colonel Imoka Soshiro. Colonel Soshiro immediately began to dig in at Laogong. Meanwhile, the bulk of the 55th and 56th Regiments were holding on to the Nanyang-sik area, as General Liao's 65th Regiment cut their withdrawal route off on June the 1st. While the rest of the 22nd Division were applying pressure from the north, The heavily outnumbered Japanese had no choice but to quickly cut a trail southeast, finally withdrawing on June the 7th. Their retreat was chaotic. Both regiments lost contact with each other, and with their subordinate units as they made separate ways towards Mang. It would only be the 3rd Battalion 56th Regiment who would arrive at Mang by June the 10th. Most of the others would reach Lakakwang in late June. While retreating, their artillery units were intercepted by the pursuing Chinese, and the artillerymen chose to die with their guns. While the 22nd Division and the 149th Regiment pushed towards Mang, General Sun had also sent his 113th Regiment to take Ziyun, and the 114th Regiment to advance southwards to support the Chindits' assault against Mogang. The Chinese were able to encircle Mang from the west, north, and east, as the 149th Regiment moved across the fields into Mang to take the settlement on June the 16th, pushing Tanaka's battle-weary troops to the hills south and west of Mang. Meanwhile, Brigadier Calvert was able to reach the Mogang area by the start of June. 12 miles from Mogang, Calvert's forward troops began to run into Japanese patrols and snipers. Despite taking losses, the 3 and 6 Gurkhas, led by Colonel Claude Rome, who had in his previous incarnation been the overlord of Broadway, pushed on, seizing the western heights overlooking Mogang on May the 31st. On June the 1st, Calvert's South Staffords linked up with Rome and the Gurkhas at the village of Lohinchi. Other elements of the brigade reached the southern foothills of the heights, 3 miles south of the town. On June the 2nd, they went straight into the fray. On that same day, the Lancashire Fusiliers— just realized I said that British and then French. The Lancashire Fusiliers. Yeah, sorry for a sidestep there. It's actually very difficult for me to say that not French. Quebec upbringing, I guess. And the South Staffords also attacked Lacum, held by some ordnance troops and the field hospital. The leading parts of the Fusiliers— that is surprisingly difficult for me to say that in English, and I'm an Anglophone. I have no idea why. I guess it's one of those words I've just grown up speaking only in French. They were soon pinned down by heavy fire. The impasse only broke when a Bren gunner of the leading rifle section went wild, running up and, quote, "straight up the hill, firing from the hip, and screaming curses at the Japanese." Softening up the Japanese with airstrikes from the Air Commando Mustangs, troops of the 1st Lancashire Fusiliers and the 1st South Staffordshires attacked and wrestled the Lacum village away from the Japanese and occupied the summit of the range up the hills overlooking the city to the northwest. Calvert decided he would need to build a base akin to the White City, where he could collect supplies and build an airstrip to take out the wounded. Calvert fixed his eye on the village of Lacum, occupying a strategic spot on the eastern foothills of the heights overlooking the Mogang Plain. Upon capturing the village, the Chindits would also find substantial ammunition, a field hospital, and buildings which had obviously hosted several Japanese headquarters. The country leading up to Lacum, however, was hard stuff. It was in the midst of thick jungle, intersected by deep ravines. The path proved difficult to follow as it sometimes wound around a ridge and sometimes went straight up and down it. The place was a defender's paradise, however. It was described as a handful of resolute men could hold successive hilltops for hours against a large force, such as ours, overburdened with mules and heavy stores. In response to the new threat, Colonel Okada Hokuji rushed over with some units of his 128th Regiment to protect Mogang, leaving his 1st Battalion to face the rapidly approaching 114th Regiment and immediately recalled his 3rd Battalion from Sinton. Alongside this, General Honda ordered General Takeda to turn back from Mkenya and instead secure the Mogang-Kaming area. Thus, the chance to lift the Siege of Myitkyina was lost. By June the 3rd, the Chindits had built a new airstrip near the Tapa Ferry, allowing airdrops of supplies and equipment to spill in. Calvert was now ready to launch his attack. Early on June the 8th, the 1st South Stafford set off to secure Pinhimi. The village was defended by elements of the 3rd Battalion 128th Regiment, who were also protecting some ammunition dumps in the area. The Staffords routed the Japanese and destroyed the dumps, clearing the way to the bridge. By now it was the afternoon, and they stepped aside to let the 1st Lancashire Fusiliers to move on to capture the 150-foot-long bridge. All seemed well until the hail of gunfire shattered the silence, tearing into the Fusiliers. 2 companies were pinned down in a ditch, while another was in the jungle further down. At around 6 p.m., Calvert arrived at the front to confer with Major David Montith of the attacking company. It was decided that 2 platoons under the cover of motor barrage would dash across the bridge and secure the other bank. Calvert's mind went to the 4.2-inch mortars. He intended to use them to deadly effect now. 2 platoons of Fusiliers moved on the bridge, with 1 platoon attempting to move along the ditch, only to struggle against the thick, waist-high grass. As the second slipped off the road into the jungle, the motorists about 60 yards behind them began firing, slowly at first, but then it sped up as men could drop bombs into the tubes. The men with fixed bayonets charged across the bridge. The Japanese waited until the British were halfway across before they opened fire. Tracers filled the little space, bullets tearing into flesh. The Chindits toppled left and right. Some crawled on their bellies, trying to get just far enough to throw their grenades upon the enemy positions. At 6:15, it was all but over. The retreat was called. Calvert summoned U.S. airstrikes. Mustangs showed up, bombing and machine gunning the enemy emplacements, but one Mustang mistakenly bombed a group of fusiliers unloading mules. Because of the unexpected opposition, Calvert would instead direct his forces to ford the Wetak-Chung and then take the Mohong and Yuathit-Gal, which successfully fell on June the 9th. The following morning, a Gurkha company attacked towards Kyangki and the railway to create the impression that the main attack would come from this direction, while the bulk of the 3 and 6 Gurkhas made a wide right flank advance to attack the bridge from the rear. At dawn on the 10th, Shaw's Gurkhas moved forward, waist deep in marsh water and mud. The bridge assault party was under the command of Captain Michael Alman, a one-time cavalryman commissioned in the Indian Army in 1942 after escaping from Singapore. Alman moved his men forward warily. The approaches to the bridge were narrow, with the road up a high embankment with swampy, tree-heavy low ground flanking both sides. Coming in from the marsh, the Gurkhas set upon the bunkers at the bridge with grenades and small arms fire, but the Japanese held their ground. At 10 a.m., they tried again, shooting and hurling grenades from amid waist-deep mud at the Wetak. Alman, who was close to the shore, charged, throwing grenades to scatter the enemy. He closed in to kill 3 with his kukri. Rallied by his heroism, the Gurkhas rushed the remaining defenders, capturing the bridge. About 35 Japanese were killed at the bridge, and the Gurkhas captured 1 medium machine gun and 2 light machine guns. In return, the Chindit casualties in the encirclement and the capture of the Pinmi Bridge came to about 130 killed and wounded. By mid-afternoon, Calvert had deployed 2 battalions up the Mogang-Pinmi Road, while a third occupied the bridge area. Conquering the bridge saw the Chindits suffer 130 casualties, while Okada's troops had also suffered heavy casualties. Yet they had successfully delayed the Chindit advance for 4 days, which allowed Takeda to bring the bulk of his forces back to Mogang. Knowing full well that the Japanese had been able to reinforce Mogang, Calvert decided to wait for the arrival of the Chinese troops that Stillwell had sent to reinforce him. But in the meantime, he launched a successful attack against the courthouse on June the 11th, followed by a failed advance towards the river. To secure his right flank, Calvert had decided to send a company of South Stuffords under a new replacement officer named Major Archie Waffle Jr., son of the vulnerable viceroy, to secure the area between the road and the Mogang River. The Stuffords made a good headway, but near the river they came under heavy fire from entrenched Japanese. Waffle was hit in the wrist. The bullet almost took his hand off. He was then pulled out of the line and he walked back to the field hospital near the Gurkha village, clutching onto his hand, which was now hanging by a sinew. That night, the surgeons at the Gurkha village were to remove the hand entirely. Waffle Jr.'s war was thus over. In the end, the Stuffords had also pulled back towards the road after the loss of their commanding officer. By June the 15th, the Chinese had still not appeared. Thus, the Chindits ultimately had to withdraw from Pinmi. Back over at Mkenya, artillery was arriving by air. 2 batteries plus 1 platoon of 75mm howitzers, 2 105mm and 2 155mm howitzers were landed. All except 2 pieces with Galahad were kept under headquarters control. During the siege, they fired 600 tons of ammunition, very rarely with massed fire. Boatner renewed his offensive on June the 13th, sending almost all of his forces to attack the town from all directions. The American-Chinese forces would struggle to make much progress against General Vinegar defenses. Utilizing a system of night attack and daylight defenses, heavy casualties were consequently inflicted upon the enemy, and large supplies of weapons and ammunition were captured and used in the defense of the city. On June the 12th, the Japanese hit a platoon of Company K, new to Galahad, so hard that the company broke and reformed on the L Company's line. The portion of the Japanese thrust that hit the perimeter next to the river made most of the men take off, but 2 stayed in place and repelled the Japanese with automatic rifle and machine gun fire. To the west of this little break, the Japanese worked their way in close, but they were stopped by grenades and small arms fire. As a result of the attacks, however, the 3rd Galahad Battalion had cut the mckena Ferry Road and reached the Irrawaddy north of Mkenya by June the 17th, with the 150th and the 80th Regiments also gaining up about 200 yards. The Allies needed to capture the Mkenya-Mogang-Soprabum road junction, but for such few gains, Boudinot had lost many men, and thus he had to stop his attacks on June 18th. Stillwell ordered the end of all infantry attacks. Boudinot replied that he would stop attacking the Japanese positions until, quote, until our troops are steadied and favorable opportunity presents itself. There was a reason for the troops needing to be steadied. Companies A and B of the 209th Engineers were to cut off from their main body by infiltrating the Japanese. Trying to close in on them, Company C, the headquarters and the service companies, were in turn halted by Japanese. The condition of Companies A and B became critical during June the 14th, for they only had one meal with them. Two of their men managed to work their way back to the block on the Soprabum road with news of their plight, but enemy small fire prevented airdrops. The isolated companies finally made their way back in small groups to the rest of the battalion over on the 15th and 16th of June. The 3rd Battalion of Galahad reported trouble in effecting reorganization and enforcing order. The Americans were not alone in their problems. Two companies of the Chinese 242nd, which had made a small penetration into the Japanese lines on June the 14th, were wiped out by a counterattack that very night. These setbacks emphasized the nature of the Mkenya fighting. The Allies held a ring of a battalion and a regimental strongpoint, enclosing a similar Japanese system. Though the Allied strongpoints were close enough for the troops in one to sortie for the aid of the other, should it become necessary, they were not so close that interlocking fire could be put down to close the gaps. Consequently, there was plenty of room for maneuver and ambush, and the inexperienced engineers of the new Galahad troops also suffered at the hands of General Minikami's veterans. On the other hand, the Mkenya garrison did not emerge entirely unscathed, as they too suffered heavily, losing approximately 1,000 men during the month of June alone. But that is it for today with the CBI Theater, as we now need to head over to New Guinea to start the Battle of Lone Tree Hill. After the fall of Wakte, General Tagame had sent Colonel Yoshino Nayasu's 223rd Regiment to cross the Tor River inland to attack Harare, while Colonel Matsuyama Somon's 224th Regiment attacked the Tom area from the other side. In the meantime, General Doe's 163rd Regiment patrolled across the Demento Creek and the Tor River, encountering heavy Japanese resistance at Mafin, but successfully repelling some enemy counterattacks. While the 163rd strengthened its defense of the Tor and Harare area, Doe would also see the arrival of Colonel Prue Herndon's 158th Regiment on May the 21st. General Kruger's plan was to use this regiment in a vigorous overland drive towards Sarmi, aiming to throw the enemy onto the defensive and therefore securing the Wakte area. This decision was based upon scanty and incomplete information concerning Japanese strength and dispositions. The Japanese had no intention of abandoning Sarmi and the two airstrips between the town and the Tor River without a desperate struggle. The Americans were also finalizing their plans for the operation against Biak, codenamed Operation Hurricane. General Fuller's plan was to land the 186th Regiment in the Bosnik area at 7:45 a.m. on May the 27th to secure the Green Beaches in two jetties. Once the two jetties were secured, LCIs bearing the 162nd Infantry, supporting troops, and the Task Force Reserve were to move inshore and unload. LSTs were also to move to the jetties when the beach area surrounding them had been cleared by the 186th Infantry. LCMs bearing the artillery, tanks, and engineering equipment were to move to the beaches as soon as the channels through the coral were found or made, or for the jetties in the waves following the 186th Infantry assault companies. As soon as it had been reorganized ashore, the 162nd Infantry was to advance rapidly west along the coast from Bosnik to secure the three airdromes. This drive was to be supported by 8 tanks of the 603rd Tank Company and the 146th Field Artillery Battalion. The fields were to be repaired quickly to accommodate one fighter group and to be expanded to receive an additional fighter group and a heavy bomber group, a reconnaissance group, a night fighter squadron, and one photo reconnaissance squadron. Mukmerdrome was to be the first field developed. Brigadier General Edwin Patrick would also replace Doe in command of the Tornado Task Force, as the latter would resume its duties as Assistant Commander of the 41st Division. Admiral Feckler's Task Force 77 was to provide naval support and cover the assault shipping. Naval fire support was to begin at H-45 minutes, 6:30. From that time until H hour, cruisers and destroyers were to expend 400 rounds of 8-inch, 1,000 rounds of 6-inch, 3,740 rounds of 5-inch, and 1,000 rounds of 4.7-inch ammunition on targeted airfields in areas west of the landing beaches. After H hour, the cruisers would continue intermittent fire on the airfields, bombarding targets of opportunity, and respond to calls for support from forces ashore. Because there were many known or suspected Japanese gun emplacements along the southern shore of Biak, counter-battery fire would take precedence over all other types of fire. Bombardment of the landing beaches was also to begin at H-45 minutes. 5 destroyers were to bombard the beaches and the adjacent area until H-30 minutes, when they were to move westward to join the cruisers firing on the airfield area. Then 4 of the other destroyers were to continue beach bombardment until H-3 minutes. Total ammunition allowance for beach bombardment was 4,900 rounds of 5-inch and 4.7-inch shells, while 40mm and 20mm ammunition was to be expended at the discretion of individual ship commanders. Rocket and automatic weapons fire from the 3 rocket-equipped LCIs and 2 SCs was to provide close support for the assault waves. The fire was to begin at H-5 minutes and it was to last until H-hour or until the initial wave was safely ashore. Meanwhile, General Kenny would toss 52 B-24s to bomb the beaches just before the landings. Additionally, medium bombers and fighters from the 5th Air Force would cover the force from the air. And from May the 17th onwards, the bombings of Biak's airfields would increase sharply in violence to soften up their defenses. As elsewhere along the absolute defensive zone perimeter, primary emphasis was laid upon the construction of airfields. Between 1943 and 1944, 2 of the 3 projected fields in southern Biak were completed and put in operational use by planes of the Navy's 23rd Air Flotilla. Their usefulness ended almost immediately, however, when the Allied vastly superior air forces began operating from Hollandia bases. As in the Wakdes Army sector, the concentration of effort on airfield construction until the Hollandia invasion resulted in dangerously delaying the preparation for ground defenses against Allied amphibious attacks. In the 5 weeks which elapsed between the Hollandia and Biak invasions, the Biak garrison forces, under able leadership and by dint of desperation effort, succeeded in organizing a system of strong cave positions, which would prove highly effective after the enemy landing. However, time, equipment, and manpower were so short that defensive preparations could not entirely be completed. Some 15-centimeter naval guns brought to Biak immediately after the Hollandia invasion to strengthen the coastal defenses were still unmounted when the island was attacked. On May the 23rd, the 158th advanced west of the Tor River bridgehead. The advance of Company L met increasingly strong resistance. Japanese defenses were centered around 3 small brush-bordered lakes near the beach at about 1,800 yards west of Tor. The rest of the 3rd Battalion 158th Infantry, across the Tor before 11:30, quickly moved forward to assist Company L, which had been pinned down along the main coastal track west of the lakes by Japanese machine gun and rifle fire. Company K pushed up to the left flank of Company L, while Company I moved towards L's rear. With the aid of motor fire from 80mm weapons, the companies M, K, and L were able to push gradually forward during the afternoon, advancing on a front about 400 yards wide. Finding that the attack was not progressing as rapidly as they expected, Colonel Herndon ordered his 1st Battalion across the Tor. The 1st Battalion did not start moving until about 2 o'clock, and could not get as far enough forward to join the attack before dark. Tanks would probably have been great help to the 3rd Battalion, but by the time the mediums of the 1st Platoon, 603rd Tank Company, moved across the Tor, the forward infantry troops had already halted for the night. In the end, Companies L and K would dig in for the night across the main coastal track about 400 yards east of Mafin. The following morning, after an ineffective motor and artillery bombardment, Herndon resumed the attack. Despite the lack of extended artillery support, Companies K and L moved out as planned at 7:30. Company L on the right advanced along the beach encountering only scattered rifle fire, but Company K on the main road had hardly started when Japanese machine gun and rifle fire from concealed positions in the wooded area, over to the left of the front, halted their advance. Unable to gain any ground, Company K called for tank support. 2 tanks together with a flamethrower detachment from Company B of the 27th Engineers arrived at Company K's lines about 10 o'clock. With the flamethrowers and tanks blasting the way, the infantrymen overran the Japanese defenses, killing 10 of the enemy and capturing 2 machine guns. The remainder of the Japanese forces, probably originally some 40 men strong, disappeared into the jungle south of the road, whence scattered rifle fire continued to harass Company K. Company L reached the outskirts of Mafin, No. 1, at about 2 o'clock. The movement had been slow, not as a result of Japanese opposition, but because the battalion commander did not believe it prudent for Company L to advance far beyond Company K. Despite the return of 2 companies, most of Colonel Cato's engineers would have to withdraw behind the Turfom River against heavy firepower. Captain Saito's reconnaissance unit meanwhile retreated into the jungle south of Mafin alongside 1 engineer company, which was under Cato himself. Over the Turfom River, however, the Americans were again stopped by tenacious engineers, which again forced Herndon to request tank support. As the tanks moved into position, elements of the right sector force, comprising Captain Sato's men of the 1st Battalion, 224th Infantry, and an engineer company, trudged out of the jungle. The enemy was quickly thrown back with heavy losses by combined fire of the 4 tanks of Company L's riflemen and machine gunners. However, under the cover of their infantry attack, the Japanese had dragged a 37mm anti-tank gun forward out of the jungle. As the enemy infantrymen withdrew to the southwest after the death of Colonel Kato, the anti-tank gun opened fire. It was soon destroyed and its crew was killed, but not before 3 of the American tanks had been so damaged they had to be withdrawn for repairs. Facing such heavy resistance, Herndon then sent his 1st Battalion to carry out a deep envelopment to the south across the Turfome. Yet these troops would similarly be unable to break through by nightfall. After killing 28 men and wounding 75 others, Kato's force allowed Tagami to dispatch the 2nd Battalion, 223rd Regiment to reinforce the Ilir Mountain line. On the morning of May the 25th, Major Matsuoka Yasake also arrived there with an infantry company to assume command of the remainder of Kato's forces. Meanwhile, Yoshino had crossed the Tor River 3 days behind schedule to the east, and Matsuyama was assembling on the right bank of the Tomato River. Herndon relieved his 1st Battalion with the 3rd and then pushed west with his 2nd Battalion following behind them. The next objective for the 158th was going to be Long Tree Hill. Long Tree Hill, known to the Japanese as Mount Ilir, had been named for a single tree which was depicted on its crest, by the map then employed by the Americans. Actually, the hill's coral mass was covered with dense rainforest and jungle undergrowth. Long Tree Hill was about 175 feet high, 1,200 yards long north to south, and 1,100 yards east to west. The north side dropped steeply to a rocky shore on Maffin Bay. The hill's eastern slope was fronted by a short, violently twisting stream which was promptly dubbed the Snaky River by the 158th Regiment. The main road curved away from the beach to the pass south of the Snaky River and Lone Tree Hill through a narrow defile. The southern side of this defile was formed by 2 noses of Mount Saxin, a terrain feature about 100 feet higher than Lone Tree Hill. The more westernly of these noses was named Hill 225, known to the Japanese as Mount Sento, after its height and feet. No name was given to the eastern ridge line, which pointed towards Lone Tree Hill from the southeast. There was also a small native village at the eastern entrance to the defile, and another at the pass's western outlet. Now, Mount Saxin was a name given to an indefinitely outlined hill mass which formed the northern extremity of the Uri Mountains, extending inland from the coast at Lone Tree Hill. The name Saxin was specifically applied to a prominent peak about 2,000 yards due south of Lone Tree Hill. On or about May the 23rd, General Tagami had moved his headquarters into the Mount Saxin area, apparently on the southwest side of the central peak. Herndon's forces continued the advance through the abandoned enemy positions, albeit without tank support, for they could not cross the fragile Turfome Bridge. In the afternoon, the Americans were finally halted below the southernmost bend of the Snaky River, subjected to heavy machine gun fire and intermittent artillery bombardment. General Patrick, who had succeeded the command of the Tornado Task Force during the morning, was informed of the opposition encountered by the 1st Battalion. He ordered the advance stopped for the night and instructed the 158th Infantry to remain well east of the Snaky River so that the American artillery could register on the native village and the defile without endangering the forward troops. Harassed by a few artillery shells, which by now had been recognized as originating from Japanese 70mm or 75mm weapons, the 1st Battalion pulled back 500 yards east of the Snaky. A perimeter was then set up, with the battalion's left resting on the road and to the right of the beach. The 2nd Battalion established a series of company perimeters back along the road to the east. Casualties for the day had been 22 men killed and 26 wounded, almost all being in the 1st Battalion, while about 50 Japanese had been killed. When the attack orders for the day had been issued, it had been hoped that the 1st Battalion could reach the top of Lone Tree Hill before nightfall. Since the unexpectedly strong enemy opposition had prevented the realization of this hope, plans were made to continue the advance westward on the 26th. The ultimate objective was the east bank of the Waski River, 2,000 yards west of Lone Tree Hill, and the intermediate objective was the native village at the eastern entrance to the defile. The advance was preceded by naval shelling on the northern slopes of Lone Tree Hill from 6:30 to 7. A 15-minute artillery preparation was also to precede the advance. The infantry would start moving at 8:45. The next morning, naval fire started 10 minutes late. 2 destroyers lying offshore shelled the northern slopes of Lone Tree Hill and the Maffin Bay area, firing on known or suspected enemy defensive positions and assembly points. After a 20-minute bombardment, the 2 support vessels withdrew. Artillery fire did not begin until 8:30. The time lag gave the Japanese ample opportunity to prepare for an infantry attack, which had been heralded by the destroyer fire. The artillery, aiming its shells into the defile and against the eastern slopes of Lone Tree Hill, ceased firing at about 8:45. A few moments later, the 1st Battalion 158th Infantry, Company B, again leading, started moving westward. The infantry's line of departure was nearly 1,000 yards east of the village at the southeast foot of Lone Tree Hill, and the advance had to be slow because the road ran through heavily jungle terrain. The enemy therefore had sufficient time to reoccupy positions in the defile and on Lone Tree Hill, which might have been vacated during the American artillery barrage. The value of both the naval and artillery bombardment had been lost. Herndon's 1st Battalion moved again against Lone Tree Hill. Company B moved forward to the point at which it had been held up by the previous afternoon and was again stopped, this time by fire from the southeastern corner of Lone Tree Hill. Company D's heavy machine guns were brought up to spray a densely wooded area in front of the point rifle platoon. The fire dispersed the Japanese riflemen, and Company B moved forward again. Less than 100 yards of ground had been gained when the company again encountered machine gun and mortar fire originating from the native village. Company A, initially off the road to the right rear of Company B, turned north to the mouth of the Snaky River. One platoon crossed at the river mouth at 10:30, but was quickly forced back to the east bank by the Japanese machine gun fire from the rocky beach below the northern face of Lone Tree Hill. Artillery support was called for, supplied, and proved successful in stopping the enemy fire, and at about 1:50, all Company A crossed the Snaky. Orders were to move down the western side of the stream to establish contact with Company B and send one platoon up the eastern slope of Lone Tree Hill to probe for enemy positions. Other efforts were meanwhile being made to scatter the Japanese opposing Company B. Company E moved up the left flank of Company B, the south side of the main road. The combined efforts of these two rifle companies proved insufficient to dislodge the Japanese from their positions on the eastern entrance to the defile, and the enemy fire forced the American units to seek cover. Company F was therefore ordered to pass through B's left flank and to proceed to Hill 225 to take the Japanese positions from the rear. Company F's attack could be started before dark, and Company A, moved up the western side of the Snaky, was unable to relieve much of the pressure upon Company B. Finally, Company A was forced for a second time to withdraw to the eastern bank of the river as a result of enemy fire from Lone Tree Hill. Tanks would have been of great help to Company B, but the bridge over the turf foam could not bear their weight, and the road west of the stream was in such disrepair the tanks probably could not have negotiated it. Only Company A would manage to cross the Snaky River through much effort, yet it would be unable to relieve the pressure from Company B's front and would have to retreat by the end of the day. To prevent further casualties from being inflicted by Japanese patrols, which were expected to roam around the flanks of the forward elements during the night, a semicircular perimeter was ultimately established. Although Herndon's attacks on May 26 had been completely unsuccessful, the 158th Regiment had located and probed some of the principal Japanese defenses in the area and were now ready to launch a more effective assault. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there, I'm in the process of releasing quite a few long-format documentaries, about an hour to 2 hours long each. They cover the 19th century history of China and Japan, and they are built upon footage I filmed about 3 years ago. I mispronounce everything. But nonetheless, I think they're going to be a lot of fun to watch. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to my exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what I'll tackle next. Please check it out. General Vinegar Joe was experiencing some major setbacks, but it looked like Mkenya was as good as his. However, the American officers' reports of how difficult the going was for the Chinese was quite disheartening. Over in New Guinea, the Allies were yet again faced with a great obstacle, now in the form of One Tree Hill.